Have you ever heard a phrase that sounded harmless, but felt deeply wrong? It might have been said with a smile in a calm voice, even wrapped in affection. But something inside you, your gut, your intuition, whispered, "This isn't love. This is control." Welcome to the invisible world of emotional manipulation, where the most dangerous traps don't come from raised voices or broken promises. They come wrapped in sweet words, phrases that seem reasonable until they erode your peace, your identity, and your sense of self-worth. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And often, the people we fall for, sometimes even love, are doing exactly that. Instead of facing their wounds, they speak from them. Instead of growing, they resist. And in the process, they subtly train us to shrink. In this video, you're going to discover 5 phrases that may seem common, but are in truth red flags, hiding deep patterns of emotional immaturity, projection, and manipulation. If a man says these to you repeatedly, don't just listen, pay attention. Because your future peace, clarity, and emotional freedom may depend on how you respond. These aren't exaggerated warnings. These are grounded in Jungian psychology and timeless Stoic wisdom tools that help us see through the illusion and reclaim our power. But here's the twist. This isn't a video about hate. This isn't about men versus women. This is about consciousness, about truth, about protecting the sacred relationship between your intuition and your integrity. If you're the kind of woman who has worked on herself, who has read, healed, reflected, grown, then you already know the cost of ignoring your instincts. You've been there. You've tried to understand. You've tried to be patient. But there comes a time when understanding turns into self-abandonment. That's why this video exists. Because words matter. The right words empower. The wrong ones, subtle repeated, can slowly strip you of your self-trust. So if you've ever felt confused after a conversation, unsure why something he said didn't sit right, even though it sounded normal, you're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're probably picking up on a shadow behavior. And once you see the pattern, you can break it. By the end of this video, you'll not only recognize these 5 toxic phrases, you'll know how to respond with clarity, calm, and strength. No arguments, no over-explaining, just boundaries made visible through wisdom. So stay with us, because the ability to name what harms you is the first step in taking your power back. And remember, you are not here to decode someone else's shadow. You are here to walk in your light. Let's begin. There is a phrase many have heard in relationships spoken softly, or with frustration, or in the aftermath of a conflict: "You have to accept me as I am." At first glance, it seems noble, even honest. Isn't authenticity a virtue? Don't we all crave to be loved for who we are not, who someone wants us to become? But when Carl Jung spoke of authenticity, he didn't mean the refusal to evolve. He meant the courageous journey inward into the self, not the mask. True self-acceptance, in Jung's view, is inseparable from self-awareness and transformation. So let's be clear. When a man uses this phrase as a shield to avoid growth, it is not a sign of strength. It's a red flag. Let's look deeper. The shadow behind the statement. Jung believed that every individual carries a shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress or deny often because they don't align with the image we want others to see. But what we bury doesn't vanish. It waits in silence, influencing our relationships, our fears, our reactions. When a man says, "You have to accept me as I am," and uses it to excuse irresponsibility, emotional distance, or poor behavior, he is not showing you his true self. He is showing you the parts of his psyche he refuses to acknowledge, his shadow. Instead of examining his habits, his defensiveness, or his unwillingness to meet you halfway, he turns it into your problem. He makes your desire for growth seem like an attack. He hides regression behind the mask of realness. And in doing so, he invites you into a dynamic that Jung would describe as projective identification, where you begin to carry the burden of his denied growth. You become the demanding one, the nag, the unaccepting partner. Why this phrase is spiritually dangerous? Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires facing the shadow, integrating our hidden parts, and continually refining who we are. The moment we say, "This is just how I am," without the willingness to confront our patterns, we halt that process. Worse, we invite others to participate in our stagnation. If a man refuses to evolve but expects love to remain, you will find yourself rowing a relationship boat alone. You'll try harder, compromise more, shrink your voice, soften your truth. And every time you do, you move further from your center. That is not love. That is slow self-abandonment. The lie of radical acceptance. Let's dispel a myth here. Radical acceptance doesn't mean tolerating emotional immaturity. It doesn't mean staying silent when boundaries are crossed. Acceptance in its highest form is mutual. It honors both your humanity and mine. When someone says, "Accept me as I am," they must also accept you as you are growing, evolving, unwilling to be gaslit into compliance. As Jung might say, the one who demands acceptance while refusing self-examination is not seeking connection, they are seeking control. What healthy growth looks like. A conscious partner doesn't hide behind that phrase. Instead, they say, "I know this is an area I struggle with. I want to work on it. I hear you. Let's figure it out together." That is the language of individuation, of psychological adulthood. Because at the heart of every evolving relationship is not perfection, but presence. Not excuses, but effort. Not stasis, but shared evolution. So the next time you hear this phrase, don't get swept away by its simplicity. Ask yourself, is he truly being authentic or avoiding responsibility? And more importantly, is this a dynamic where both of you are rowing, or just you? Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Don't let someone else's unconscious become your emotional destiny. Stay aware, stay sovereign, stay growing. Imagine sitting across from someone on a first date. The wine is poured, the atmosphere warm. Then he leans in and says casually, "All my exes were crazy." You pause. Maybe you laugh uncomfortably. Maybe you don't know what to say. But inside, something stirs, a small flicker of discomfort. That flicker is not paranoia. It's your psyche speaking. Carl Jung warned us of projections, the unconscious act of placing our own denied traits onto others. When a man repeatedly describes his former partners as unstable, toxic, or irrational without reflection, he's not offering insight. He's exposing his shadow. The psychology of the eternal victim. Jung believed that the unexamined psyche seeks patterns. If a man has only ever been the victim in his past relationships, it's not a coincidence, it's a pattern. And patterns, when left unchallenged, become prisons. When someone paints every former partner as crazy, what they're really saying is, "I take no responsibility." He's telling you, perhaps unconsciously, that he hasn't grown. He hasn't done the inner work. He hasn't faced the truth that relationships are co-created, that his role mattered too. This is where danger brews. Not physical danger, perhaps, but emotional erosion. because when a man enters a new relationship still rooted in the narrative that he was always the hero or the victim, he brings his unhealed wounds with him and makes them your responsibility. The shadow and the feminine Jung taught that each man carries within him an anima, his inner feminine, the unconscious image of woman within the male psyche. When this anima is unintegrated, it becomes distorted. The man projects this distorted feminine onto his partner, often expecting her to heal what he himself refuses to confront. So when he says, "My ex was controlling," but shows signs of emotional withdrawal, what he's describing may not be Harriet, may be his own fear of intimacy. When he says, "They were always dramatic," what he might be avoiding is a confrontation with his own emotional instability. These projections are not innocent. Over time, they can shape your identity. You begin to ask yourself, am I overreacting? Am I being too sensitive? Is it me? And the cycle begins. A test of emotional maturity. In reality, emotionally mature people can speak about past relationships with nuance. They can say, "There were challenges, and I had a part in that. We brought out difficult parts in each other. I've learned from it." But the man who calls all his exes crazy is not inviting you into truth, is auditioning you for a role. The role of the exception, the one who will finally understand him. But be warned, when the relationship hits inevitable bumps, the script will shift, and you might find yourself cast in the same villainous role as the women before you. Jung said, "What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate." If a man hasn't made his emotional patterns conscious, you will bear the weight of his fate. His shadow will fall on you and call itself love. What to watch? For here's how to stay grounded. Listen. For accountability. Does he ever reflect on his own role in past conflict? Look for patterns. Are all his stories the same? Does every woman become the problem? Observe his self-awareness. Does he speak from growth or from grievance? And most importantly, don't confuse empathy with rescue. You are not here to redeem someone's romantic history. You are not the healer of his unresolved psyche. That's his journey, and no one can walk it but him. Final reflection. Carl Jung taught that healing comes through integration, through facing the parts of ourselves we fear, deny, or project. A man who cannot do this will ask you to carry his emotional weight, and if you say yes, you will begin to disappear, slowly, silently, until you forget what healthy love even looks like. So if he says, "All my exes were crazy," pause. That's not a red flag. That's a map of what's to come. And it's okay wise evento walk the other way. At the heart of every human relationship lies a fragile but sacred contract freedom. The freedom to choose to give, to say yes, and just as importantly, to say no. But what happens when love becomes a bargaining chip? When the words, "if you really loved me," are not a question of affection, but a demand disguised as devotion. Carl Jung would have called this a manifestation of the shadowy part of the unconscious that seeks control, not connection. And the moment love is used as a tool for leverage, we are no longer in the realm of the heart, we are in the realm of power dynamics. The false currency of conditional love. On the surface, this phrase may seem like a plea. It appears emotional, tender, perhaps even vulnerable. But look again. Behind the softness hides a weapon. "If you really loved me, you'd do this" is not a request for closeness. It's an ultimatum. One that tests your loyalty not through trust, but through compliance. Jung reminded us that love, when unconscious, becomes dangerous. It shifts from mutual growth to emotional dependence. And this phrase is a clear sign that one partner is no longer relating to the other as a whole person, but as an instrument to fulfill their own unmet needs. The Stoics echoed this insight. Seneca wrote that true love is not about bending another to your will, it's about walking beside someone freely without coercion. Yet this phrase subtly breaks that principle. It replaces genuine connection with fear of rejection. It says, if you don't obey, you don't care. The archetype of the manipulator. Jungian psychology invites us to look beneath behaviors into archetypes' universal patterns that show up in human interaction. In this case, the archetype behind this phrase is the manipulator. Not always malicious, often wounded, but still dangerous. The manipulator often uses emotional closeness as leverage. They blur the line between love and obligation, between care and control. This can leave the partner often a deeply empathetic woman questioning herself, wondering, am I being selfish? Am I not loving enough? Maybe I should give in. This internal doubt is the goal. Because when your self-trust is eroded, you become easier to control. The inner conflict, love versus self-abandonment. Here lies the tragic paradox. The very thing that makes many women deeply loving, compassion, care, devotion, can be used against them. And when that happens, a woman may find herself trapped in a dilemma: preserve the relationship or preserve herself. But here's what Jung and the Stoics both affirm: true love never demands the betrayal of the self. When a man says, if you loved me, you'd ask, is this coming from connection or from control? Is it rooted in mutual respect or in fear of losing dominance? Because authentic love has no need for conditions. It does not measure devotion in favors or sacrifices. It does not manipulate through guilt. It simply asks, are you free to be yourself with me? The way forward: awareness and boundaries. The first step out of this dynamic is awareness. Recognize that guilt tripping is not an act of love, it is a form of emotional manipulation. Jung taught that once the unconscious becomes conscious, it no longer controls us. That's the power of naming the pattern. The second step is boundaries. Healthy boundaries are not walls, they are gates. They protect your peace while allowing for genuine connection. A woman with strong boundaries does not fear loss. She knows that losing herself is a far greater price than losing someone who cannot love her without conditions. Final reflection. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And no relationship, no matter how romantic, passionate, or promising, should ask you to give up that birthright. If someone weaponizes your love to get their way, that's not love. That's the shadow pretending to care. So the next time you hear, if you really loved me, don't just hear the words. Listen for the energy behind them. And if it feels like pressure, guilt, or fear, step back. You were not born to be someone else's puppet. You were born to love, yes, but to love with clarity, freedom, and self-respect. Imagine for a moment someone looks you in the eyes, someone who once claimed to cherish you, and says, you're not enough for me. The words fall like cold rain. But what you must understand is this: those words aren't really about you. Carl Jung taught that what we fail to recognize in ourselves, we project onto others. So when someone speaks this kind of sentence, cutting, belittling, emotionally surgical, they are not describing your value. They are exposing their own shadow. The shadow speaks through criticism. This phrase, "You're not enough," is rarely a fact. It's an emotional weapon, a tool of control. It's not an observation, it's a projection. When someone feels hollow inside, disconnected from their own inner worth, they may unconsciously try to drag others into that same void. Jung referred to this as the act of seeing the shadow in others and not in ourselves. In this case, the speaker cannot confront their inner dissatisfaction, so they blame you for it. You become the scapegoat for their own emptiness. Reclaiming meaning from psychological warfare. Words have power, but their emotional intention has even more. A man who says, "You're not enough for me," isn't being brave or honest. He's often avoiding the painful truth that nothing will ever feel enough until he heals the parts of himself that are broken. This is the eternal hunger of the fragmented ego. He may chase perfection, he may compare, he may demand more, but in the end, he is grasping at something external to fill what is missing within. Jung would argue that no amount of external validation status or partners can complete what a man refuses to integrate from his shadow. The inner dialogue of the conscious woman. Now let's shift the focus to you. If you've ever heard those words, "You're not enough," you likely felt the sting. Maybe you even believed them. But what if those words weren't an insult? What if they were an invitation, not to shrink yourself, but to see the speaker's wound? A conscious woman pauses. She doesn't internalize every attack. She filters it through awareness. She asks, "Is this my truth? Or his projection? Am I really not enough? Or is he incapable of recognizing fullness because he lives in scarcity?" And here's the insight: a woman who knows her worth does not negotiate it. She may listen, she may empathize, but she does not accept false mirrors as reality. From wound to wisdom. Jung reminds us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. If you stay in a relationship where your worth is constantly questioned, you may start to mistake that emotional erosion for reality. But here's the truth: you are not too little. You are too aware for someone who isn't ready to meet themselves. It takes immense courage to walk away from someone who makes you feel small. But it's even more courageous to stay whole in a world that constantly asks you to fracture yourself for love. Don't shrink shine. In a world obsessed with perfection, be the woman who chooses authenticity. You were not born to chase approval from someone who refuses to see your light. You were not meant to be measured by the wounds of another person's ego. If a man says you're not enough, ask yourself, what part of him feels lacking, and why is he placing that burden on me? Your self-worth is not a performance. It's not a resume. It's not a checklist. It is your quiet inner knowing that who you are right now is complete. And anyone who cannot honor that does not deserve access to your energy. Final thought. When someone tells you you're not enough, pause. Then, with the wisdom of a woman who sees clearly, walk forward, not to prove them wrong, but to live in a truth they could never contain. As Jung might say, you don't need to be understood by those who are still blind to their own reflection. You only need to understand yourself, and from that place, never settle for anything less than respect. There are few phrases more deceptively simple, yet more emotionally corrosive than this one: do whatever you want. On the surface, it may sound like a shrug, an offer of freedom, even indifference. But beneath it often lies something far more toxic: passive aggression, masked control, and emotional manipulation. Carl Jung would recognize this not as authentic communication, but as a projection of unacknowledged resentment from the shadow self. Let's look deeper, because these words are not harmless. They're a symptom of something broken in how two people relate to one another. The shadow speaks without speaking. When someone says, "do whatever you want," but their tone drips with sarcasm, coldness, or emotional distance, what they're actually saying is, "I'm angry, but I won't take responsibility for that anger." Instead of expressing their true thoughts and feelings, they throw the burden onto you to guess, to interpret, to decode. This is what Jung called indirectness of the unconscious mind. The person does not speak directly because the ego avoids confrontation. But the shadow, the part of the psyche they haven't made conscious, finds another way to speak through sarcasm, through ambiguity, through silence, weaponized. This phrase is not permission, it is a trap. Why it hurts more than an argument. Healthy relationships require clarity. Communication that is clear even when it's uncomfortable builds trust. But this phrase creates a psychological minefield. You're forced to tiptoe, analyze, and second-guess. You find yourself replaying conversations, wondering what you did wrong, even though no one has said anything real. This dynamic is deeply destabilizing, not because of open conflict, but because of what's missing authentic dialogue. Jung emphasized the danger of repression. What isn't expressed doesn't disappear, it grows in the dark. And so, in these passive-aggressive statements, we see emotion that's been buried too long: anger, insecurity, fear of abandonment. Instead of being owned and communicated, it becomes a tool for control. The cost of emotional decoding. When someone habitually uses phrases like, "do whatever you want," they're not respecting your autonomy. They're punishing you with silence and ambiguity. Here's what happens. You begin to lose your emotional balance. You try harder to please, to fix, to make it better, even though you don't know what you did wrong. You live in reaction, not intention. This leads to exhaustion. You become more attuned to their moods than your own truth. Your sense of self becomes secondary to managing their unspoken pain. As Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But those who don't accept their shadow often inflict its chaos on others. From passive games to active freedom. A conscious woman sees through the illusion. She hears "do whatever you want," and instead of taking the bait, she recognizes the game and refuses to play. She may say, "I won't make decisions based on guilt or silent judgment. If you have something to express, I'm here. But I won't guess." This isn't cold. It's clarity. Clarity is not unkind. It's the most compassionate thing we can bring to relationships. Because without it, connection becomes performance, and intimacy becomes manipulation. The path to emotional integrity. Here's the truth. A man who speaks in riddles is not protecting your feelings, he's protecting his own avoidance. And a woman who's done the inner work knows you cannot build truth on silence. You cannot build love on guilt. So the next time you hear, "do whatever you want," pause. Ask yourself, am I being invited into dialogue or being pulled into emotional confusion? Is this a relationship based on clarity or on coded messages I have to unravel? If it's the latter, walk back into your center. Your peace is not worth sacrificing for someone who lacks the courage to speak plainly. Final insight. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And who you are is not someone who begs for clarity. You are someone who lives in truth and expects the same from those who walk beside you. Don't decode. Don't shrink. Just see clearly and act accordingly."